Evening all. Welcome to the first episode of Dispatches from the Culture Wars. This is where I'll be looking at one particular aspect of the Culture Wars and giving my opinion and my reasoning on what's going on in the news. So I want to talk about something that happened on Channel 5's The Wright Stuff this morning, hosted by Jeremy Vine. The topic was about statues, controversial statues that are perceived to cause offence and that some people want torn down. And it goes back to the original one in the United Kingdom, the original one that was targeted, the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. So on the show, you had two guests who represented very different opinions. On the one hand was Emma Webb. You may have seen her on the New Culture Forum channel on YouTube, and she's also part of the Save Our Statue campaign. On the other side was Femi Oluwole, who is a pro-European Union and left-wing political pundit. And he is very much of the opinion that these offensive statues should be taken down. The Colston statue should be removed. And also Colston's name removed off buildings in Bristol, and so on and so forth. Now, at one point, Emma Webb was making a point that her point was that rather than tearing down statues and removing names and removing place names and plaques and changing names of pubs, all that, it should be allowed to stand. And then if people want to add to the historical and cultural landscape, building their own statues of their own current heroes, they should do so, but they should not tear down an existing statue in order to do that. Femi then he cited an example to her. Would Emma be happy with a statue of Jimmy Savile in her street opposite her house? And Emma was stunned by that. She said it was a very abstract point, and it is an abstract point. And I think it's a false equivalence as well. Femi then also went on to say that Edward Colston was a slave trader responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of black Africans. Now, I'm going to tackle that last point first because that is actually historically not true. Edward Colston was not a slave trader himself. What he did was that he owned shares in a trading company, and one of the things that this company traded in were slaves. So they would send ships to West Africa, where they negotiated to purchase slaves off one of the African kings. I think the King of Dahomey was one of the primary sellers of slaves in that region. There was also Arab slave traders as well in Africa, and that was who was selling the slaves to the British slave trading companies, who would then take them to the West Indies, because slavery in England was illegal and has been illegal to own. It has been illegal to own slaves in England since Anglo-Saxon times. There was also a case in the 18th century. It went to court. Somebody challenged the law to say that they could own slaves in England, or the United Kingdom it had become by the 18th century, and that was defeated in court, and the Anglo-Saxon law was upheld. So that's just a bit of background information. So so it's wrong to say Edward Colston is a slave trader, and this is what you see in the news now. When this story first broke and statues were coming down, and there was all these calls to take down statues, rename places, remove names of certain people from buildings. At the start of this movement, people called slave trade. Then it got modified to these people have links to the slave trade, which is a way of acknowledging that they weren't slave traders directly. What they did was that they were connected somehow to a company that traded slaves. And now the current euphemism for this, and you'll hear it in the news, is people who may have profited from the slave trade. So they're not even sure that the money that these people had invested, the shares that they had invested in these trading companies, were accurately connected to the slave trade. They could have been connected to some other aspect of that company's trading enterprise. So now we see the official language that you hear in the news has changed from the slave trader such and such to such and such who may have had links to slave trading. Okay. So that was where Femi was historically inaccurate. When he says that Colston had murdered tens of thousands of black Africans, Colston was not directly involved. Colston himself did not travel to Africa. He was not a slaver himself, so he couldn't be responsible. He's very distantly connected, but also with the slave trade. Yes, there were all these deaths and these horrific conditions, but at the same time, just murdering so many slaves is actually counter to making profit, counter to trade. You don't want to damage the goods, putting it crudely. So the conditions were terrible, and there were deaths that resulted from that, and also taking them to the West Indies, which had malaria and yellow fever back at that time, and so they would be killed through that. But that also affected white settlers in the region. It affected everybody. So it was very disingenuous. But then Femi's using hypercharged language, because Emma was using kind of calmer, rational language, like saying, why can't we keep what's there and then add to the cultural and historical landscape? So Femi was using hypercharged language because he knows that comes across, it gets in your face on television. It's a sort of TV debating tactic, and it fires up his supporters, fires up his base. And that's why he's using hypercharged language like that. But let's return to his point about Jimmy Savile, a statue of Jimmy Savile. You see, this is a false equivalence, because Savile used his charitable works in order to get close to vulnerable children that he could sexually exploit. So he was setting out to commit a crime. Colston was not setting out to commit a crime, and he wasn't directly involved. As I said, he is he's somebody who has shares in a company rather than being at the forefront of slave trading, which was, at that time that he lived, was not illegal. It may have been immoral, but it was not illegal. Whereas Savile he was committing crimes. So the equivalence isn't, would you object to a statue of Jimmy Savile? The equivalence would be, would you object to a statue of somebody who was involved in one of the charities that Jimmy Savile supported or ran? And the name that I can think of off the top of my head is Esther Rantzen. Okay, Esther Rantzen, TV presenter, famous for hosting a long-running series called That's Life. She was also heavily involved in children's charities. She helped set up Childline, which was a phone number that children who were feeling very vulnerable, feeling abused, feeling neglected, feeling anxious could ring Childline and get expert help and counselling over the phone, and then being referred to other child protection resources. And so she was heavily involved in setting up Childline, and that was something that Jimmy Savile came along and helped support. And so Esther Rantzen worked closely with Jimmy Savile on these fundraising activities with children in need and things like that in order to raise money for these charities. But here's the thing. Rantzen probably knew that Savile was not on the level, that there was something wrong. She suspected, and the accusations are that she turned a blind eye to the suffering of the children that were coming into Savile's purview, into his physical space, where he was visiting children in the hospital, he was visiting children out and about, and then subsequently abusing him. And that Rantzen sort of turned a blind eye, or that she may have been doing some covering up, or she may have thought, well, the important thing are these charities must be supported, so therefore I have to go along with a man like Jimmy Savile because his fundraising abilities at that time. He was famous for these fundraising ability. He was raising millions of pounds. And so there's this kind of the suspicion and accusations that Esther Rantzen was making kind of a pact with the devil for what she saw as a greater good. And you can draw a parallel with Edward Colston. The fact that he's got shares in a company, and one of that company's businesses, one of its portfolios, is slave trading. But he's also a great benefactor. He's a great patron of Bristol. He's building kind of hospices. He's building schools. He's building things to elevate the citizens of Bristol, make their lives better. So you can argue that he's making a kind of pact with the devil. Yes, but I'll use this money in order to benefit my community. Okay, in the way that Esther Rantzen would say, yes, I'm Jimmy Savile. There are lots of suspicions, lots of allegations against him, but he can raise money for these good causes. Okay, so then the argument becomes, and a discussion could be had, do you remove Esther Rantzen's name? If there was a plaque, I'm not going to go as far as to say that a statue to Esther Rantzen, but let's say there's a plaque, there's somewhere where she lives, or somewhere that's that she made a significant change to, the Esther Rantzen community hall or something like that. And would you tear down a plaque that said, here lived Esther Rantzen, or this is the Esther Rantzen Community Centre? Would you tear that name down? Would you change the name because she enabled somebody like Jimmy Savile to operate? That's the interesting and more accurate parallel to draw. And I think it's important to stick to the facts. Now, there's a YouTube channel called Voltaire's Ghost, which does an excellent video about the real history of Edward Colston, looks at it using the historical record to find out who he was and if the accusations against him are fair and accurate. And I would recommend everybody to go and watch that. I'll put a link in the description below. And I think it's really important that we base our arguments in historical fact and not hyperbole and narrative. And so I'm calling Femi out on this one. I think he made a false argument, a fake equivalency, and was using hypercharged language, which was actually not factual and distorting the truth. And I think we all want to serve the truth. We all want to be as honest as possible. So on that note, I'll see you on the next Dispatches from the Culture War. Goodbye.